Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I hope that you're all well. I have a very exciting program for you today. I have the honor of being joined with a number of scholars connected to the issue of the environment and what some call the environmental crisis. And we're going to be on here talking about that in the first hour, me and my panel, and then we'll be opening that up to questions. So you guys that are here early, like Chip D, Selflow, and Mary Buddersheim, please do make sure that everybody understands. I want to say hello to Gina and Shrumaju. I hope you guys are all good. And I want to stress, guys, when we do come to the question and answer session, I'm looking for questions on the topic. I'll shortly be bringing in my panel, but if you like what we are doing here on this channel, then please do support through considering becoming a Covenant partner. You should be able to see the links in the description box, as I hope to be doing this full time and to be doing evangelism full time. However, this topic of the environmental crisis is not something that is going to go away. It's something that is only going to loom larger and larger on our politics, on our economic decisions, and on our lives in general, including the culture and then the ethical and moral decisions that then flow out of that. Now, whether you believe that there is an environmental crisis, whether you believe that's man-made or naturally occurring, or whether you believe that there isn't a man-made crisis, the reality is that the movers and shakers of our world believe that there is one. And that is why the church needs to have an understanding of it and have an understanding of how we should respond and in what way. Now, as you can see, the title does seem to imply a certain angle on this, and you guys probably know from other videos of mine that I do believe in the environmental crisis. However, this is open for skeptics, and we want skeptics to engage with the panel, to put sensible points across and to ask questions. And so if you're a skeptic here or you've got doubts about the environmental crisis, feel free to bring your best evidence, your best points and your best arguments against the panel of scholars that we are going to be bringing on shortly. I'll allow them all to introduce themselves as that was decided, and we will start with our Professor Merrick. Would you like to just introduce yourself, sir, to everyone who's watching?
Sure. My name is Merrick. I'm an oceanographer. I didn't start out as an oceanographer. I did degrees in mathematics and a PhD in applied mathematics, and I've also got a degree in theology. I'm married. I've got 4 children and 3 grandchildren, and I go to my local church. So I'm sort of across the border between science and theology. But my main scientific interests are the role of the ocean in climate change.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor, and welcome on board. The next one we'll bring in is Carl.
Yes, hello. Pleasure to be here. My name's Carl. I'm a PhD student. I'm studying at Imperial College, and I'm looking at the role of I look at climate change and heat waves and how the dynamics of the atmosphere are being affected by climate change.
Wonderful. Welcome, Carl. The next one will be Chloe.
Hi, lovely to be here. I am a PhD student. I do geography though, so I look at the impacts of climate change, and like Carl, I also focus on heat waves, but very much more impacts than physical dynamics.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Welcome on board. Good to have you. And finally, Neil.
Hi all, great to be here. My name's Neil. I'm a researcher at Climate Analytics, and I'm focused more on the policy and solutions side of climate change. So my research looks at how different low carbon technologies can help us cut emissions rapidly. Yeah, really great to be here. Looking forward to engaging in the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me. I really appreciate that. We have a tradition here that just before, as we start each live stream, we read a psalm as a prayer. So Professor Merrick, as our elder on the panel, could you pick any psalm you like, any psalm, and if you would just read it all the way through as our opening prayer, please.
Hang on a second.
Just to prove that he is a Christian, guys.
I had to get my Bible off the shelf. Nobody warned me of this. This is a...
Sorry, yeah, I'm really bad at telling people I'm going to ask them to do that, and then usually drop it on them after we've done the intros.
So this is Psalm 19.
Okay.
The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they display knowledge. There is no speech or long language where their voice is not heard. Their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of the earth. In the heavens he has pitched a tent for the sun, which is like a bridegroom coming forth from his pavilion, like a champion rejoicing to run his course. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the earth. Nothing is hidden from its heat. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The precepts of the Lord are right, giving joy to the heart. The commands of the Lord are radiant, giving light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. The ordinances of the Lord are sure and altogether righteous. They are more precious than gold, than much pure gold. They are sweeter than honey from the comb. By them is your servant warned, and in keeping them there is great reward. Who can discern his errors? Forgive my hidden faults. Keep your servant also from wilful sins. May they not rule over me. Then will I be blameless, innocent of great transgressions. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So, thank you again for joining us. I suppose we should probably kick off by just one of you guys describing what is meant by the words environmental crisis. So, like, what is in essence, the crisis that the environment is facing? I'll let that be the opening gambit to anybody who wants to jump in. I can stop directing at people. Unmute, guys. There's no need to be on mute.
So I think environmental crisis can apply to many different things. My particular concern is with the issue of climate change and global warming. So there, because we've been pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the planet is warming with all sorts of negative consequences. So to me, that's what the environmental crisis is all about.
How would you go on, Neil?
I was just going to build on what Merrick was saying. I think, to me, the word crisis means two things that are really important. So first is about the severity of the problem, and second is about the pace at which we need action. And so if you look at how humans are impacting the planet on a whole range of metrics, so Merrick's highlighted a really important one, climate change and the rise in global temperatures. But if you look at the level of pollution in our rivers and in our seas, or you look at the level of deforestation on lots of different metrics, it's very clear that the level of damage that I would argue humans are having on the planet is very severe, much greater than what it's been throughout history. And the pace at which we therefore need to act is also greater. So that's, in terms of the word crisis within that, I think we
So
can
it's about
argue
the severity and the speed of the change.
Yes, and therefore also the speed with which we need to act to address this.
But hasn't the planet always had changes in its temperature? I mean, back at the time of the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago, it was a lot hotter than it was today.
Everybody asks this question all
yeah,
the time.
I'm going to be one of those people. Like, how would you respond to that?
Yes, that's correct. The climate has always been changing. It wasn't a static climate. But what we know is that from natural patterns, if it wasn't for anthropogenic warming, so human-induced climate change, we would likely be going into an ice age right now. And basically, we've reversed that. And if you want to look into it, like there's this theory by Ruddiman, 2003, which looks at the Anthropocene and something called the early Anthropocene, and this is where he shows this. And basically,
could you just clarify what Anthropocene is for people that may not know what that term means?
Oh, okay, yeah. So Anthropocene is basically the human age, and it's a debated. So we have geological periods. So the one before the Anthropocene would be the Holocene, which was from about 12,000 years ago till 2,000 years ago would be argued, but we're now living in the human era, so the Anthropocene. And what this means is, as Merrick said and Neil said, we have been causing an increase in carbon dioxide, which we know causes a rises in temperatures, and this is now a crisis because it's sped up and it's like a hockey stick, a famous climate change graph. So although the climate has always been changing, we've now kind of taken over as the main forcer, the main driver, and it's going off the scale, which is not good for any of us, and has catastrophic impacts for us as a species, to be honest, as well as other species.
Yeah, I guess the point of it being a crisis is that we're going to be impacted by it, If you were to give just one example of evidence that would demonstrate the fact of severity and speed impacting the environment, I'll give you a minute to think about it, but when you're ready, just come forward with one example that you would like to offer as something, as an evidence to the fact that there is a speed and severe change to the environment that's been driven by man.
Would I be allowed to share my screen at this point?
Yes, if I know how to make you. Can you try and see?
How does that look?
Yeah, I can get that on. There we go. Boom.
Excellent. Okay, so just essentially to illustrate everything that Chloe has said, this is the hockey stick graph. So this is measurements of global mean surface temperature. So on the y-axis, you see essentially there's a standardized period. So it's like subtracting a mean. So we're looking at changes, departures from the mean of global mean surface temperature, and you can see that it has varied quite a lot. So these are the kinds of climate changes that people have discussed in the past. People discuss a kind of medieval warming period, for example. So on the x-axis here, these are years. And then we can see since the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, there has been a rapid increase, an increase that is far greater than has actually ever been observed. This rate of change of our global climate has not ever occurred in geological history. So this is an unprecedented warming. So this is a global metric that you could look at and consider many other impacts that this global metric has. So we are looking at we have greater than 1 degree of warming, and then this is being manifested across many different examples of we can see like sea ice loss, we can see increased forest fires, heat waves, Chloe will be able to tell you lots about, for example.
Okay. I take it I see the dip. I saw the dip. It's all right. The temperature was going down. I don't know why I'm pointing at the screen. No one can see what I'm pointing at. But like I saw the dip, and Chloe, is that the sort of ice age that you were referring to that we were meant to be heading
basically.
into?
So it's to do with sun cycles, actually. So we have these sun cycles called the Milankovitch cycles, and because of where we were at in that sun cycle, it was going down, and so the temperature is highly correlated to that. So we were going down into an ice age, basically. So yeah, it's actually really interesting. This is what I used to do before I did heat waves. I used to look at past climate changes, and what basically, if you take a signal of temperature reconstructed from the past, you can take out these sun signals from any temperature because they're highly correlated. So yeah, this was going down, and before we had this increase in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, which caused this massive increase.
So I guess going back to this commonly held belief, and I just want to sort of marshal the argument, and I want to make everyone who's watching this clear that in the second hour we'll be opening this up for you guys to come in and ask your own questions. But I want to give the chance for the live stream to fill up, and I also just want to get the sort of brain juices flowing. A lot of people, and this was also something that I've thought about in the past in my naivety and lack of education, that obviously at the time of the dinosaurs, the global temperature of the Earth was higher. Do we know how much higher it was at the time of the dinosaurs vis-a-vis now, and why was it so high back then? And therefore, why couldn't it be some sort of natural process? And I'm not just ignoring what you've just shown me, but I just want to try and explore that line of thought.
I think one thing to bear in mind is the speed at which changes occur. When Chloe was talking about sun cycles, and we're talking about cycles that are sort of 40,000 years, 100,000 years, long time scale changes, where the ecology, the planet, life on the planet has time to adjust. We are seeing change, unprecedented change over 100 years. So in terms of speed of change and size of change, that's very different to saying you've got some slow change in the cycle, which gives time for animals and plants and things to adapt. We're not allowing any of that to happen. In fact, what is driving is extinction events.
And this, for me, I think is kind of, and I don't know if any one of you got any sort of stats or information on this that you could present, but this for me is one of the, I would beg a belief if anyone would want to argue that we aren't impacting other species and wiping out other species. The amount of wildflowers in the UK is diminishing. The insect population. When I was a child, you used to drive down a motorway and you'd be scraping all the insects off your grill, and now you don't. And I don't think cars have improved that much in terms of their aerodynamics. But also the fact that there's a number of endangered species, and that number is increasing, particularly the larger mammals. I remember as a kid being concerned for the whale and so on. This is an element that is, for me, completely indisputable, but is the easiest thing to grasp for people. And, do you have any sort of examples or thoughts that you can feed into that in terms of human behavior is impacting species, but directly, like we're farming more land, but then do we have examples of where, say, chemicals or something we've done to an environment, but not directly, say, taking land, has impacted a species? Did that question make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. And there is really good evidence that actually climate change is one of the biggest drivers of biodiversity loss. So when we're talking about species extinction, we're talking about, the loss of biodiversity. And the latest UN reports on the Convention for Biodiversity, which is looking at this, identifies 5 key drivers, and some of them are much more direct, like you say, you know, obvious examples of overfishing the seas. If we fish too much in the seas, fish stocks go down, they're threatened with extinction. But actually right at the top of the list of those 5 is climate change, and that's because climate change drives significant habitat loss. The obvious example being species that live in the Arctic. So they're designed and they've evolved totally to live in this Arctic tundra, you know, with certain types of climates. If that climate changes very slowly over time, and this comes back to that pace point, then there may be the chance for those animals to adapt. But if that climate changes incredibly rapidly and the patterns that they're used to in terms of when they need to have their winter coat, when their food comes through, all these different things get disrupted, then they will really struggle. And we're already seeing species in the Arctic regions, which are the regions which are warming fastest in the planet, really struggling. You know, polar bears, which are used to hunt, you know, I don't want to use the polar bear trope because actually, you know, climate change impacts so many more animals than just polar bears, but it's a good example. You know, they're used to performing their hunting season on ice that's thick enough to hunt on. As the temperature warms, that ice is becoming much more fragile and breaking up much earlier, and polar bears are struggling much more to hunt and get their prey, and so we're seeing their numbers fall. That's one example, but there are many others.
I think there was some kind of walrus. It shows you how poorly educated I am. There was some kind of walrus that would breed on the ice packs, but those have disappeared, and now they're finding these islands. But the islands are insufficient to their population, and they're just cramming themselves on to these islands. And I think, you know, that's something that is observable and much more graspable than these more ethereal ideas like, you know, temperature change. So one of the kind of arguments that I've heard, and I wonder what your thoughts are, is that our records are incomplete. How can we have a measurement, you know, like the graph that Carl showed us? So he showed us a clip that gave us 2,000 years, but perhaps that 2,000 years belongs to a much longer pattern where it would look normal, if that makes sense. You know, what are your thoughts to that comment?
Well, there's a number of methods from studies of paleo data that allow you to go back different lengths of time with different amounts of detail. I mean, the classic one is the ice core method, where you drill ice cores in Antarctica, 4 kilometers worth of ice core, and like tree rings, because the snow falls each year and it gets layered up, you can actually go back about, I think they've gone back to about certainly 800,000 years, and you can measure the changes, and you can calibrate the ice core by temperature. So you can see the temperature changes. You can also, from the little bubbles trapped in the ice, you can get the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and all sorts of other interesting things that you can find. For example, you can know when big volcanoes have gone off because they leave a layer of ash in the ice core.
Oh, nice.
So all these things, and there are other methods, sediments in the ocean, and all sorts of other ways that you can go back effectively, certainly millions of years. And I'm not an expert on those sorts of techniques, but certainly my colleagues who do that, who can reconstruct temperature records going back, like I say, from the ice core data, at least 800,000 years. And you can see the cycles that Chloe was talking about, which are related to how the Earth is going around the sun and all sorts of other changes in the Earth's orbit on long time scales, 40,000 years, 100,000 years. And that's clearly visible in all these data.
Okay, so I mean, for me personally, I accept the fact that there is human-driven climate change, human-driven environmental impact. So let's kind of move the conversation forward a bit. And based on the assumption, and for anyone who's a skeptic in the audience, we're going to let you on. So I hope you're preparing your best questions and your best arguments. But let me put it bluntly. How screwed are we? Like, and I mean that seriously, because the messages that come through on the politicians and through the news is that, oh, if we do it now, then we can avoid disaster. But I don't think that that's true. I think that whatever we do, we're simply talking about a scale of disaster. I wondered what your thoughts on that were.
I think you're right. So there was an IPCC report, so Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out last week, and it basically showed that instead of being able to limit to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, we'd only now be able to limit to 2 degrees warming. So in terms of like things like heat waves, that means that we'll see a massive rise in heat waves. And I was just reading a paper today which showed that even that small increase of 0.5 would make a huge difference to the amount of the tropics that would become unlivable, because we wouldn't be able to live there because they'd be too hot to live in. And we have experienced like a few hours of that now, but it's like unimaginable. But I always think about this quote by this other climate scientist called Mike Hume, and apparently he was quoted saying that it was never too late to start acting, but it was also like never too soon as well. And I think as a Christian, I just am hopeful that someone will start acting, and it will be enough, because I just want to look after the world. And that's something I do through my faith. So I'm just kind of always trying to be more hopeful that something will happen and we won't completely destroy the planet. Because I don't think that's really, that's not God's will either. So
yeah, what would you demonstrate? What would you use to demonstrate that? Because in Genesis it says that we were meant to dominate the earth. How would you reply to that?
Very dodgy interpretation.
I agree, but there are lots of people that would use that interpretation. So,
if you think about the word rule, which I think is the word actually used in Genesis.
Yeah.
If you think about our example of rule, who is our example of rule from Scripture? It is, of course, Jesus, who's
Amen.
The true king, the true ruler. And he's hardly what one might call dominant, destructive, following his own agenda for his own benefit or for making money or for anything else. He comes as one to serve and to lay down his life. So, I think if you think in terms of rule and what sort of rule we're supposed to be exercising as human beings, we're supposed to be the image of God, representing God. Surely we should be exercising rule the way Jesus would, with some degree of humility and some degree of servanthood, not some exploitation and dominance.
Amen. And the whole point of Christ's redemptive act is to bring us back to that sort of Genesis paradigm where we are God's priest on earth, who has the responsibility to be God's viceroy on earth, to tend and to care for the garden, which is, I was kind of hoping one of you guys would jump in with that, but I'll just jump in it for you. It's kind of like, to tend and to care for the garden, and the earth is the garden that we've got to tend and to care for. But I mean, we're talking about the sort of scale of the catastrophe that we're having. In my head, are we looking potentially an extinction level event for human beings?
Personally, I don't think that we're currently heading for an extinction level event with human beings. If we look at current policies, the current efforts that governments are making to tackle climate change, that puts us on warming compared to pre-industrial levels of around 3 degrees by 2100. Now that will have a catastrophic impact, and we shouldn't in any way be complacent about that. But personally, I don't think we're going to see the loss of all human life. What I would say though, and this comes back to your question earlier, you were saying, how much trouble are we in? I think one of the big questions is, who is the we that we're talking about here? Because actually, it's very clear that the impacts of climate change will be greatest in areas in the global south or in the tropics. These are often areas which have done the least to cause climate change. They've got very little historical emissions, and they've done the least to cause the temperature rise, but they're going to suffer the most from it. And it's very plausible that even 1.5 degrees of warming would put hundreds of millions of people, particularly in these countries which are already facing other challenges around food poverty and development, it would put them further into poverty. There would be, it's awful to say, but I'm confident that there will be many deaths from climate change in the thousands, potentially in the millions. I don't think there will be in the billions. I don't think that this is a human extinction event, but I don't think that's any reason to be any less complacent, because the scale of the impact, and particularly because it's falling on the most vulnerable, who, again, if we think in scripture, we look at in the Old Testament, the repeated concern of God through the prophets and the Psalms and throughout the scriptures for the most vulnerable in society. Those are the ones who will bear the greatest brunt of the impact of climate change. And so even if it's not going to cause extinction for human beings, we should still be really concerned about it. And like Chloe says, hopeful about it, because again, the truth is that we can change this. I believe that as a human, but also, as a follower of Jesus who believes that as humans, we're made in the image of God, and we have the capability for great goodness and great transformation, as well as for evil and sin that we see so clearly as well.
Can I just emphasize one point? I want to emphasize the point that Neil made. I think one of the problems we have, we all live in rich countries, or countries with wealth. And we're also in places generally, like in the UK, where the impacts of climate change may not be as severe as if you're in sub-Saharan Africa or a small island in the middle of the Pacific. And I think we are, to some extent, blind to the impacts because we are not suffering hugely at the moment in terms of impacts. It's the poor people of the world who will suffer the worst impacts. And I agree with Neil. I think God's got a concern for the poor as expressed through the prophets and through Jesus and through the whole of Scripture, actually, that, our actions are contributing to the suffering of the poor. And I'm not sure that's particularly glorifying to God, nor a good way to go as Christians.
No, and I do want to sort of come on a bit later to sort of the Christian response, but I still want to focus a little bit more on the sort of impacts of the.
Well, I think the thing is, we're all been talking about in the future, but actually the impact of climate change is right now. So we've been all talking about how, there will be thousands of deaths in the tropics, but actually there has been thousands of deaths in the tropics. And so there was a study that came out last year that showed that 1 in 3 heat deaths, so just from heat waves, not including other hazards that can be linked to climate change, were actually linked to climate change. So, and that's over the historic period. So that's since 1970. So this isn't an issue that's just in the future. So it's happening right now. And so it's important because we, like my church, work with people in the global south and other churches, and they work with them on issues like, farming and rain-fed agriculture. And they don't know when the rainy season is going to come now. And they knew, like historically over time, when they were going to plant their crops, and it's a real issue. And then sometimes they plant their crops, there's a massive rainstorm because the monsoon's more intense now in that region, and it washes all their crops away, and that's their whole livelihood. They can't send their kids to school. And like, I don't have that. I don't have kids at the moment, but if I had kids in the UK, it's probably unlikely, even if my house was flooded, that I wouldn't be able to send my kids to school. But this is a reality for these people. And even if they have flooding and they have aid, it takes them months, if not years, like a lot longer than the UK, to get their house back, which is not good. So they're already suffering, but it's just getting a lot worse. And I agree with Neil and Merrick. I just don't think that's what God wants.
I think. I mean, there's also the point that a large part of the global south is Christian. So these are our brothers and sisters that are suffering, And as Christians, the scriptures are clear that do good to all men, but especially those in the house of faith. And when one part of the body is suffering, the whole body feels the pain. And so, this issue that impacts the global south impacts the church, and therefore, in terms of Christian solidarity, we've got to take seriously the what they're going through, and not simply ignore it. But I wanted to, I just want to come back to some of the things that I heard. Like, I think part of the problem in terms of people in the West realizing the sort of speed and the severity of the change is in some ways its slowness to impact us and our ability to use money to shield ourselves from it. So we're not
absolutely. You know, I mean, just take a couple more examples of impacts. I mean, Chloe's got much more expertise in this area, but a couple of things that I've been working on recently and learning about is, you know, the impact of tropical storms on the GDP of these countries. So obviously GDP is not a perfect metric. It doesn't measure everything in an economy, gross domestic product, to avoid the acronyms. But it does give an impact of the scale of these storms. You know, take the tropical storm Hurricane Erica in 2015. That wiped out 90% of the GDP of Dominique. You know, these are massive, massive disruptions. And we know from the science of climate change that, you know, a warmer planet can hold more moisture in the atmosphere, will lead to more tropical storms. You know, there is, really serious and undeniable disruption in countries in the global south that we are somewhat shielded from. And that's the one point I would make on that is actually, if you look at a global level, sometimes people say that climate change is a white middle class agenda being pushed by sort of people with interests in, you know, avocados and nice sweatshirts. If you look at a global level, the people who are pushing the hardest in international negotiations across the board are the leaders from the global south. They're the African group in the climate negotiations. They're the group of small island developing states. You know, these are not middle-class intelligentsia who are, you know, coming back from their nice book reading class. They're people who are experiencing the really raw edge of the climate crisis, which, like Chloe says, is here now. It's not something in the future. And they are saying, please, please, people in the West, people in the countries who are doing the most polluting, wake up and hear our story, you know, hear our pain. And like you say, you know, many of these people are people of faith, and they're saying, you know, we are your brothers and sisters, hear our pain, hear our story, and act with us, stand with us. And I guess my research focuses on the fact that we can do that, and actually there's a really hopeful story to tell about our ability to act, and maybe we'll talk more about that in the second half. But just on the impacts, there are great and really radical and hot, impossible to deny impacts happening in other places in the world. But you're right that we're somewhat shielded by it sometimes in the West.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, a lot of people have concerns around immigration, a lot of concerns around war, but obviously, if as the climate and the environment begins to transform from the sort of environment that it is now, it's going to put increasing pressures on resources. It's going to put increasing pressures on people's viability to live in certain environments, which will therefore increase the likelihood of wars as people fight over scarcity of resources. I think there's already been discussion of the idea of water wars, but then also that will push more immigration and more mass immigration, and then you end up with larger populations in the viable areas of the world, which then creates a sort of rebounding effect of more population with less resources. I was wondering, as someone who, you know, does the geography and looks at the human impact, Chloe, you know, whether you believe that thesis has got any merit or whether you think it's simple rhetoric and hyperbole.
No, so it's been shown that there is climate migration taking place. So, but that isn't just true of humans. So that's true of species like elephants, for example. They migrate and walk further distances because of climate change than they did previously, and that's the same true of. So I think I saw a study for Uganda that showed that people, because there's quite a lot of people that live one place and then they move somewhere else, and they do that more often now because of climate change. And then there's also been shown that, as you just said, water causes an increase in conflicts. So, and then someone was also suggesting, don't want to get into this because it's a little bit divisive as well, but someone was suggesting perhaps Russia versus Ukraine could be considered a climate war because of oil. But again, that's a completely different issue. But as you said, yeah, climate change plays into geopolitics. So the role of different countries and how they interact with one another. I think a better example than Ukraine and Russia is perhaps Ethiopia and Egypt, because Ethiopia were going to build a dam on the Nile, and this was going to basically cut off a lot of water downstream, which was really like frightening populations in countries downstream because they rely on the Nile for their main source of water, and that was really not good. And then like Ethiopia at the moment is in a state of conflict as well, and then you have South Sudan and Sudan as well. They've been in conflict, and all of those regions, and it is linked to climate change. So you can link conflict to climate change. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I want to try and move the conversation forward again now to talk about a little bit about the response, because one of my concerns as A, a Christian, as B, someone who believes and agrees with the science about the environmental crisis, is that this whole agenda, that's a couple of things. One is that everything ends up getting blamed on the environment when actually the environmental crisis, when actually it's not the environmental crisis, it could be something else. But then the other thing is that people use the environmental crisis to push agendas that we as Christians can't go along with. And this is why I want to start talking about our response as Christians, because I can never get into bed with, and I never will get into bed with, any movement that's promoting abortion. I won't get into bed with any movement that's promoting the idea that it's great to have families that don't have children, or that connects or connects the environmental concern with LGBTQ issues, or that kind of anti-family agenda. So for me, the question is, how can I respond as a Christian without supporting agendas that go against the faith? And I was wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think
Carry on.
Go for it, Merrick. No, go for it, Merrick.
I can't see. That seems to me a bit of a distraction, really. It seems to me that, as Christians, our job is to do the right thing, irrespective of what's going on around us. And the right thing is to work towards reducing the problem with climate change, which means cutting our carbon dioxide emissions, etc. Those things have nothing to do with the other issues particularly.
But there are groups that are connecting those other issues.
Not that I'm particularly aware of. I've never come across that as a major issue in me trying to respond to climate change issues. I think the reason for cutting carbon dioxide emissions is to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, or stop it going up, and therefore stop climate change, and therefore stop the poor of the world suffering. I mean, it's sort of, it's straightforward. I don't see any real political complication in that. And persuading our governments and governments around the world to take it more seriously and act more quickly. The UK government has got the Climate Change Act in place, and we're supposed to be reducing our emissions. But the reality is that we're not doing it fast enough, because the government worries about the next election, which is 5 years away, not 2050 or whenever we're supposed to reduce our emissions by. They're all going to be, well, I'll probably be dead by then as well. But they're all more my sort of age, and probably not going to be around in 2050 to worry about the consequences of their current actions, which is, I think, why young people take these things more seriously, because it's their future. And we should take them seriously as Christians. We need to do stuff. We need to cut our carbon dioxide emissions. We need to change our lifestyles. We need to sacrifice. Those are things that God's called us to anyway as Christians, irrespective of anybody else's agenda.
Yeah, it's that kind of virtue ethics of you can't control other people, you can only control yourself, and we're called to be faithful regardless of what others are doing, as it were. Neil, you also wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to remark that because, as you said in your introduction, sort of climate change and the climate change debate, regardless of where you sit on your opinion on it, is here to stay, and actually the majority of political parties, as an example, in most countries accept that climate change is a reality. I think I just highlight that, yeah, you can take part, you can take action on climate change without having to align yourself with other people on other things. One of the things I was doing last year is I was working in the UK Parliament for the wonderfully named All-Party Parliamentary Group on Climate Change. Right mouthful. But basically what that means is I was working with MPs from across the political spectrum who were concerned about climate change for the very reasons that we've been talking about today, and were working on it. Now, these people had radically different opinions sometimes about a range of things, outside of the climate change agenda. And inside the climate change agenda, they had different things that they were most passionate about. Some people were more keen to really push sort of technology and excited about the power of technological innovation to help solve climate change. And that's going to be part of it. We're going to need new technologies, and there's really exciting potential for technologies. Other people were saying, well, actually, it can't just be about technology. It also has to be about the sort of lives that we live and some of the decisions that we make. And there's truth in that too. Absolutely, we can't rely only on technology. But I would say the climate problem is such a big problem that the toolbox we need to solve it is also a big toolbox. And so I actually am hopeful that climate action actually could be a broad movement that allows people with really strongly held beliefs on other things to not have to agree on those things, but still work together within this sort of broader cause.
Yeah. I would say, particularly, to anyone who watches this who say on the progressive side of politics, but does take this issue seriously, that you can't afford the drag that will be created by linking this issue to other kinds of politics. It needs to be sort of taken out of the sort of left-right argument, and it needs to be treated as a single issue on its own and not linked to anything else, because I and many people would oppose even good environmental politics if it was piggybacking anti-Christian politics on the back of it. I would have to, because I couldn't support any movement in an anti-Christian direction. So I think we've got to separate this issue out from, in the same way that politicians often talk about taking the NHS, the National Health Service, out of politics. It's kind of like we should seek to try and achieve this in terms of the environment. I want to ask you guys.
Just a comment in political terms in the UK. All the major parties are agreed about climate change and the need to do something about it. So I think in the UK we have reached that position where those parties will not necessarily agree on all aspects of whatever other aspects of politics, but they are agreed on climate change, which makes it possible to do something in a political sense, which you couldn't do if they were disagreed about that.
Yeah. Carl, were you wanting to jump in there, or did I just imagine that?
Yes. So I agree with everything that's been said on this point. But when you mention about the need to separate issues out, one of the issues you brought up was the importance of family and the Christian value on that. And there is some people make an argument that what we need to do is limit global population. That really there's just too many people in the world. People may have heard this, and that may ring alarm bells for many Christians. Is hang on, I'm opposed to abortion. I want to support families. I want to support.
I'm against euthanasia, that kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. Yes, and I am against euthanasia and abortion. The argument is very much misplaced. It assumes that the problem is too many people. The problem is much more the lifestyles that people live.
Yes.
So, for example, I've got some stats here from
share your screen.
Oh yeah, sure. I can do this. Yeah.
And by the way, that goes for all of you guys. If you've got stuff you want to share on your screens, I'm happy to show it.
So this is not looking specifically at carbon footprints, but this is looking at the rate at which we use nature and consume resources. This will look at materials and food costs.
Carl, are you able to zoom in at all?
Sure. Yeah, I essentially just want to.
If it's relevant,
to highlight some of what's going on
okay.
here. How many Earths will we need if everyone lived like USA residents? So then you need 5.1 Earths if everyone lived like the USA, 4.5 Earths if everyone lived like Australia. There's a lot of overconsumption in many developed countries. Underconsumption you can see in India, 0.8 Earths. My point here is simply to say that the issue isn't population. These countries have wildly different populations, and actually, it's not as though people in Germany have an inherently much worse lifestyle than people in the United States. I think it's perfectly possible for people to live in Germany or Japan and consume fewer resources, and it doesn't affect their well-being. So it's not clear. So the issue isn't. The issue is never overpopulation, and therefore we as Christians can be pro-family and can be opposed to abortion and euthanasia, and that doesn't have to in any way link to our response to the environmental crisis.
So it's about living more simply so that others might simply live, which is a good book, by the way.
I just wanted to make one other point on the back of that. So I'd absolutely agree with Carl that the problem is not overpopulation, but it's overconsumption, and overconsumption in particular countries. And I think, again, just to tie back to sort of our faith as Christians, here we are in the last week of Lent as we enter Holy Week, and a time to be thinking about fasting and abstinence. And obviously there's a huge tradition within the scriptures and throughout the church of thinking about the way that we live, and actually, giving things up as a way of reconnecting with God. And I think there's actually a real synergy between the Christian, I think the Christian faith with our emphasis on self-denial and fasting, and the real belief that in doing that we can actually live more fulfilled and richer lives as we're more deeply connected with God's love. Actually, there's something that we have to teach the world as part of the solution to climate change there, about sort of rediscovering that. And in a world that thinks that we should just always consume more and more and more, the Christian tradition's got a really important voice that I do see Christians sharing, and it's a great opportunity for Christians to witness to a world concerned about climate breakdown.
Because
make that point.
Because Christianity is not linked to any economic system. There's nothing sacred about capitalism. There's nothing sacred about we live. Our faith was born at a time when economy was run on the backs of slaves. It passed through a feudal age, then it went into an agricultural age, then into an industrial age and a capitalistic age, and now a consumerist age. And there's nothing inherently sacred about any of these paradigms. The faith is the faith, regardless of the economics that we live in, and we've got to live that faith out. I'd like to ask you guys, because I think that I want to sort of frame this for you to respond to. Lots of Christians fall into the trap of sort of bearing all the weight on their shoulders and thinking that they have to do it as an individual. And there are some problems we can tackle as individuals, and there are some problems that we need to tackle as congregations. Then there are some problems we need to tackle as networks of congregations. And then there are some problems that we need to tackle as like the whole people of God in a country, and then the whole people of God across the world. So using that kind of paradigm, what can someone do at the individual level? What can a church fellowship do? What can a network of fellowships do? What can the whole people of God in a country do? Those four. Like, what if you could think of one example on one of those scales and throw it into the mix?
So I think one of the things that you can do together is the issue of influencing the political system in your country. So I talked to an MP years ago, and he basically said if he gets one letter on the topic, then he knows it's a problem. If he gets 10 letters, he knows it's a serious problem. If he gets 100 letters, he knows he better worry about getting re-elected next time. And I think we as Christians can influence political things, not by becoming politicians or necessarily taking any particular political stance, But you can write to your local MP. If you, as a group of Christians in an area, individually write to the MP, you can influence their views on things, and therefore how Parliament sees things. So I think there is I hate to use the word political power because I'm not really interested in power, but there is a way to influence what's going on in the country at a level beyond the individual. We tend to think, well, I can insulate my home or ride my bike or not use the car, but there are other influences that we can have that go beyond that, but it requires more of us to participate in those things.
Okay. So that's a sort of like a congregational level.
Yeah, I mean, you write to your local MP, or several congregations in different areas could write to different local MP. There's a way of influencing beyond just local, national.
Okay. Yeah.
I'll take the individual level. I think Carl and Chloe will be able to talk well to examples of networks. At an individual level, I think I would say a couple of things. So one, there's the lifestyle that you live, and there's very clear evidence that the sort of food that we eat and the way that we travel are the two biggest things that can have an impact. So I've seen some comments in the chat, very rightly asking, well, what are these people who are on here talking about climate change? How do they live? And I'm not here to sort of, I don't say this in any way of blowing my own trumpet, but yeah, as a decision, I've given up flying as a way to cut my own carbon impact. And I've also been a vegan for quite a while of time and try and eat relatively plant-based. Not all the time, not in a legalistic sense, but I try and do that to cut my own impact. I think the other thing that we can be doing, and this is why I'm so glad to be here, and I want to be doing more of, is just talking about this. I think, so often I do spend a lot of time talking to other people who are researching climate solutions, and we all generally think the same thing, and it's so important and I do think really valuable to talk across difference. And so for the people who are here who have disagreed with 100% of the stuff that's come out of all of our mouths, I'm glad to be in a conversation with you, and we need to we can't let this become a silent issue. And so talking to one another, and of course talking to God, praying, we need to as Christians be praying, partly because prayer will change, as we pray, that will change our hearts and that will change who we are. And also because God answers prayers. If we think this is a problem, we should be praying about it and spending time on our knees before God about this crisis.
I think it's also important for me personally. One of the reasons why I think it's important to encourage conversation about this is because if we don't come up with a Christian answer to this, then the non-Christians and perhaps the anti-Christian will come up with their answer to this. But because this is a real thing, an answer is going to be required. So if we are not ahead of the curve and influencing the direction of the discourse, we might find that the direction of the solutions that the world decides to go down is in a way that we don't like and places us into sort of difficult situations. Now, we're coming up to the second hour, where I'm going to allow people who want to come in and to offer a comment, offer a question, offer a counterfactual or a counter evidence, or come in and say they agree with you and say, what about this as a solution? Or what about that as a solution? Give me a mark out of 10, or, any kind of comment or question from any angle for or against the thesis is welcome. And if you've got an evidence to bring, that is fine. I'll probably give you guys about a minute to say whatever you want to say, and then I'll take you out of the room so that the panel can reply. I'll obviously throw in comments because it's my channel and that's what I do. And then if you want to come back in, just either hang around, just re-click on the link, because I'll share the link in the chat, and you can just click on the link and you just can just come back in. If there's lots of people that want to come in, you're all going to appear on the screen below me. I will see you even if you can't see yourselves. And what you will just need to do is be patient if there's a queue, and I'll let people in sequence. and then I'll remove them in sequence. And then if you want to go to the back of the queue, you can come on again. And there's no limit on how many times you can come on. You can come on 20 times if you want. And if there's only 2 people going round in a circle, you know, sharing first and second place, then you'll get on plenty. So that's how it's going to work. I would insist that it is on topic. If you start coming in, bringing in some random issue that's not connected to what we've been talking about for the last hour, everyone will just ignore you and you will be removed, and you probably won't get a chance to come back on again so long as I remember who you are. And if no one comes on, then me and the panel are just going to keep talking. So I'm now going to share the link in the chat. And anyone who wants to come in, ask a comment, ask a question, and I will give you a minute each time. I just want to, I want to come to how this sort of connects. I think how you feel this lines up with the Bible in the sense of prophecy. I mean, I don't know what your theological positions are on this, and I have no particularly strong leaning one way or the other in this. But obviously, our Lord is returning, and He is returning to judge the world. But there's many Christians who sort of see the Bible as prophesying a really bad situation, a bad future. And I think that often disempowers those Christians from thinking that they can do anything or should do anything. And lots of Christians on lots of issues, I find, use prophecy in the Bible as a reason to sit on their hands and go, well, the Bible said it would be like this. You know, and they have this negative vision of what biblical prophecy is presenting. How do you guys respond to that sort of attitude?
Well, so I would agree with you perhaps that we were in end times as prophesied in the Bible. However, it also says in the Bible we're not going to know the exact date and time of Jesus' return. And also, on Judgment Day, I wouldn't like to sit in front of God particularly and be like, I did nothing because I thought you were coming back next week. So I'd rather act justly, well, you know, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with your God. I'd rather do that than do nothing at all. And I'm a climate scientist. I feel led to do that by my faith, and that's why I do it. And possibly people in the chat would say I'm brainwashed. Well, I mean, that's for God to judge. So when I sit in front of God, as you will, I will turn around and say to him, I did everything I could to fight for environmental justice. So
yeah, just building on what Chloe says, I think if we think about the message of the Old Testament prophets, and I think this is a pretty consistent message across a lot of them, is that although they often are prophesying, you know, the impending doom of Israel or Judah, you know, at the hands of various military empires, in that setting, the call of the prophets in the face of impending disaster is not complacency, but is faithfulness. And the prophets hold together this sense that things are going wrong, and God's judgment, you know, in the context of the Old Testament, God's judgment is coming in the form of Assyria or Babylon. But that the role of the people of God in that time is not to just throw their hands and say, okay, cool, let's just wait for the hammer blow to fall, but actually to double down into seeking God and repentance and all the aspects of what it means to be a faithful Christian. And I think, you know, on the panel we've been discussing, you know, some of the ways that we think, you know, being a faithful Christian involves concern for the planet, because, you know, of that mandate in Genesis 1 and that mandate which is then followed throughout the scriptures. Concern for the poor, again, for that mandate that is, you know, shown in the scripture. So I'd really agree with what Chloe says, and I would say, you know, I do sometimes feel disempowered, but then I remember that God's call to me is not in the midst of disaster is not complacency, but is faithfulness. And
Yeah.
all I can do is try and be faithful with the skills and time and life God has given me.
And the parables of our Lord are quite clear. Consistently, it's kind of like, how is he going to find you when he returns? A good and faithful servant or not? And that's the strongest theme, I think, in terms of the sort of the parousia of our Lord and the return of our Lord is that it's actually connected to how you live today, as opposed to worrying about, what's going to happen tomorrow. Any other thoughts or comments before I pad this out a bit?
I think from my point of view, it says, Jesus said the two greatest commandments were to love God and to love your neighbor. And the question is, am I living those commandments? And, we know the earth is the Lord's. It says that in the Psalms. Am I looking after the earth that the Lord has given us to look after? Christopher Wright had a great saying, how can we claim to love someone if we're trashing their property? And I think that's something worth bearing in mind when we think about our behavior towards God's earth. It's his property, it's his earth. And
Amen.
what are we doing to it? And then the second commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. And if I look around the world, my neighbors are not just the people who live next door, but in a global environment, in a global economy, in a global society, what I'm doing is affecting my neighbors around the world. And is what I'm doing showing love towards them? And I would question whether I'm showing love to them if I just carry on the way I've always carried on and ignore the fact that these changes are happening in the climate and in the environment, and I'm contributing to that. And if I don't do something about that, how can I claim to love my neighbor? So I think, to me, it goes back to love God and love my neighbor. If I'm not doing those things, then you can argue all you like about prophecies, but are you living the life that God wants you to be living?
Amen. Just before anyone else jumps in, we've got Rob who's going to come in. I'm going to let you in, Rob, and then you'll have a minute to say whatever you want to say, so long as it is on topic. If it's not on topic, I'm going to remove you mid-sentence, and you'll have a minute to present and say whatever you like, and then I'll let these guys respond. Now, I just want to say, I do notice a lot of people being very verbose in the comment section, and that's welcome, guys, but please come and engage with this panel. Don't just start commenting in the panel, as I've just seen someone going, oh, it's all a hoax. Well, come on and explain why it's all a hoax. Explain to this panel why they're wrong. That's why I've brought them here, so you can tell them why they're wrong. So here's your, oh, Rob's gone. Why is he gone? Oh wait, he's come back. Here we go. He might have had a problem with his internet connection. Right, Rob, I'm going to bring you in. How are we doing, Rob? You all right? Hello, Rob. Hello, Rob. Are you there? Rob. Okay, I'm going to give him 10 more seconds. Rob, can you speak so we can hear you? All right, I think you've probably got an internet connection problem, Rob, so you maybe just need to get that sorted and try again. So I'll remove you, and then when you reckon that you've got another chance, then come back. So like I say, guys, if you think that this panel, if you disagree with this panel, come and ask them a question. It's very easy to say in the comment section that they're wrong, and that's fine, but have the courage to come on and to voice your opinion or ask a question. So we were talking about our sort of the kind of sort of mentality, this kind of narrative that permeates the church in terms of prophecy that can sort of discourage people from being an activist. Right, Rob's back, so I'm gonna give him another try. Rob, if it doesn't work this time, bro, I think we'll just have to accept that there's problems with the internet. So I'm gonna let you in, and hopefully you'll be able to speak. Hello, Rob.
Hi there, guys.
Hey,
Am I
there we
coming
go.
through? Oh, there we go.
Hello.
Hi there.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Rob, wait, bro. I'm going to start your clock, right? I'm going to time it.
Okay.
I'm going to give you a minute. You have a minute to say whatever you want to say, or to ask any question you like, so long as it is on topic. Your minute starts now.
Yeah, that's no problem. So yeah, I guess I'd make a question just to ask: do we really think that CO2 is the foundational measurement of which we need to solve this problem, rather than, let's say, how we're using resources, poisoning the environment, things like that? If it is CO2, do you think we can get to a perfect CO2 level where we decide, well, that's the target. Once we get there, we can relax, the environment will take over, we can carry on with our lives now? Because we've never heard this proposed. It's never enough. It's always got to be more. We've got to tax more. We've got to control more. But we never get given this, well, what we're aiming for, what science tells us, is once we get to 430 parts per million, the environment will kick in and we can get there. So there you go. That's my question.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was very kind of you. I'm going to remove you from the studio, and I'm going to take you out of the back studio, but feel free to come back as soon as you want to ask another question. I just want to make sure that you can come back and I do this right. Sorry, talking and clicking buttons, not my... There we go, yeah. Okay, come back, Rob, as soon as you're ready. Guys, how would you respond to that?
Look,
I could respond. Oh, no, go for it, Mark.
no, go on, Neil. You let me go
I would
first.
respond to the. I'd respond to the second part of the question by saying that there will be a good level of CO2 to have in the atmosphere. You know, I'm not anti-CO2. You know, if we had zero CO2 in the atmosphere, then we'd live on a sort of ice-encrusted planet with no life on at all. It would be dreadful. You know, I'm not against CO2. What I'm against is excessive CO2 emissions at a time where we already have excessive CO2 in the atmosphere. And so before we started burning fossil fuels in sort of 1850, there was about 280 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. So if you got 1 million molecules in the atmosphere and got them all together and counted them, you'd find about 280 of them were CO2. We're now up beyond 400. And the general scientific consensus is that actually pulling it down to around 350 parts per million, that would be a good level where actually the climate disruption that we're already seeing in terms of wildfires, flooding, habitat loss, that they would be sort of dealt with and brought back within safe levels. Getting there will be a real challenge because we need to not only stop emitting, but we need to start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, which is going to be really challenging. So that, you know, there's big questions about how we get there. I'm optimistic that we could, but there is a safe possible level. I would say it's about 350 parts per million, but the number one focus has to be turning off the tap on emissions now. You know, the first thing we've got to do is stop emissions going up, stop the concentration going up. Then we can start thinking about how to get it down.
Any other comments?
Yes, I mean, yeah, it was good questions, Rob, and well put. And yes, to the first part of it is CO2 the problem? Yes, and you mentioned, that's not to exclude the other issues. We mentioned that we started this conversation by talking about the environmental crisis, and you mentioned poisoning and pollution, and there are many other gases that play into the greenhouse effect, but we didn't actually explain what this greenhouse effect is. So when you have it's essentially there's the sun and the earth gets energy and is heated up from the sun, and we have the Earth's atmosphere, and that contains certain gases like carbon dioxide, which can keep the Earth warmer by keeping energy in. So otherwise, energy would be radiated out to space, and as Neil says, the planet would be about 30 degrees cooler than it is, and it wouldn't be habitable for life. So it's very good that we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The problem is now we're adding to it. It's essentially like adding a layer of blanket, and that's essentially what we're doing to the Earth. So yes, carbon dioxide is one way of seeing the problem. The figure of 350 parts per million is definitely a very good one. That comes out of a lot of research and papers that have gone into what would be an ideal level, what would be something that we could limit a lot of these effects for. So yes.
Okay. For me, I wonder, whilst people decide whether they want to jump in or not, and the link is in, we've got Rob back, and I'll let you in just a second. In fact, no, I'll let you in now. I'll save my comment for a lull. Go on, Rob, another minute.
You're muted.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was just waiting in the background. Okay. I didn't know people. So we'll go with that 350. You can just answer this one, any of you, that we've seen in the past times where CO2 level has been up at 1,000 parts, 2,000 parts, and there has been a plethora of life. We do not see a clear correlation between CO2 levels that are much higher now and the end of life. So there's one problem that you might be able to nuance out and give an explanation for. The other one I was going to just put in as a solution, Jordan Peterson, I think, put it quite well. When we look at raising the average sort of money per person. Now, if we look in Africa in extreme poverty, when they haven't got access to lighting, electricity, the infrastructure isn't in place. Obviously, it's the local environment that suffers horribly, right? They're obviously taking out trees, they're using charcoal. You know, this is terrible. So would you say that, I mean, make things more efficient, certainly try and produce less CO2, but our main ambition, because we're going to have a growing population in Africa, is to get them as much access to cheap energy, get that infrastructure in, so they can be living.
That's your time, my friend.
Time up. There we go. I think you got it.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd like to say, so when Rob first said, is the problem CO2? For me, it's not CO2. So, I mean, it depends how you frame climate change. So CO2 is externalizing the issue to a greenhouse gas. The problem is how we live and the fact that we've caused an excess of CO2. So we can't absolve responsibility to this random gas in the atmosphere. But I would disagree with Rob. Sorry, I think he was great. He asked really good questions, but not all of Africa is so severely underdeveloped that they don't have access to electricity and that sort of infrastructure. Yes, it's not as highly developed as other countries, but if you look at heat waves, you would see power outages in both California and Argentina, and that's very different power structures. So it's also to do with politics as well, because sometimes in African nations, they'll turn off the electricity, whereas you wouldn't see that as a political sort of thing that you'd see in the UK. Of course, they do use charcoal and gas fire stoves, and that has actually shown to have negative impacts on people's health in those countries too. So yeah, we would be suggesting, but it's also about green transition. So if these countries are developing, which we know they are, and they're the fastest growing populations, but population isn't the cause of climate change, so overpopulation isn't the cause of climate change, then we need to have green transition in those countries so they can develop sustainably. But we also need to do that in this country as well, which is where things like Neil was coming in about sucking out carbon dioxide or improving carbon sinks, so like peatlands and wetlands and, you know, kelp forests in the sea, and actually even some desert regions are a carbon sink. It's all about those sort of things as well. So yeah, but I just want to say that not all of Africa is completely poor and underdeveloped. So
I just want to say that while we wait for more people to come in, and I do want to say, guys, feel free to jump onto the link. It is in the chat, and you're more than welcome to come on and to make your comments or questions to the panel. But I was just thinking that one of the things that it strikes me about this whole issue is that the old arguments between socialism and capitalism are redundant in the face of the environmental crisis. And are we really, what is part of the solution really that someone needs to envision a kind of economy and a kind of economic system that is neither capitalist, that isn't capitalist and consumerist? And clearly socialism doesn't work, so it can't be socialism. So sorry, Lister, sorry, Dust. So like, that's an in-joke, by the way, for you guys that don't get that.
Okay.
But like, or do we really need an economic system that isn't capitalist consumerist?
I think I would caution against personally thinking too much about the sort of broader economic theories into which this fits. I think it is theoretically possible to have a low carbon capitalist economy. I also think it is theoretically possible to have a low carbon socialist economy. I think it's theoretically possible to have lots of other ones. And I guess I would caution against us focusing too much on the exact economic structure within which we look, and focus much more on sort of the practical steps that would need to happen in any of those economic structures, within a capitalist world, within a socialist world, within any other third way. We need rapid deployment of renewables. We need large amounts of energy efficiency. We need to enhance our carbon sinks, like Chloe was saying. And just to sort of link that to Rob's question, Rob's question, there's been a few questions in the chat about sort of the price of energy. Don't we just need cheap energy for people? I guess to me, the good news is, regardless of what economic system you're in, whether people are doing this for profit, whether people are doing this as part of state-run enterprises, anything in between, the good news is that renewables are incredibly cheap. You want to get cheap energy to Africa, it's got abundant solar potentials, and the price of solar fell 85% in the last decade. For the people out there who are excited about capitalism and innovation and technological progress, look at renewables. They're absolutely flying. It's a really exciting story. Again, energy efficiency is one of the best ways to cut people's bills and reduce fuel poverty. So I guess I would say let's not be too focused on the economic arguments. There's really important economic arguments to have, but I would say generally let's leave those to sort of the people who really want to be focused on those. And let's just remember that in any of those systems, A, we need to do a lot. B, we can do a lot. And C, the good news is that actually a lot of those things will help us to alleviate poverty and actually make our lives better. We'll have cheaper bills, more energy for developing countries, more energy security, less trade in fossil fuels will actually reduce those geopolitical constraints. And actually we can make our lives better as we tackle climate change.
Now, because of the remaining time that we've got, we're down to like the last 35 minutes. So I'm going to try and pick up the pace a bit. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite people that want a comment to be read on screen to put at Bob. And then what I will do is I will stick those comments up for you guys to reply. Because even though we have certain people in the chat, and I know, David, looks like you have been trying to get on, but you've not been able to. For technical reasons, so that's fine. But there's been some other people who have been very verbose in the chat, but yet I'm suddenly shy when they've got the opportunity to click the link to come in and have a conversation with you. So I want to congratulate Rob for being brave and coming in with his thoughts and his comments. So we're going to be much more quicker. And also from here on in, I'm going to be maybe interrupting you more because I've been allowing you to speak, but at the time when you're speaking, like the other questions are coming to my mind, but I wanted to be a good host and allow you to say what you needed to say. So if you will forgive me from here on in, if I've got another question I want to throw in or a comment I want to throw in, I'll be interjecting mid-sentence. Please don't.
Can I make one very brief comment?
Yeah.
So we didn't respond to the first part of Rob's last question when he said, "What about 1,000 parts per million in the atmosphere?" So yes, two points to make on that. Yes, it's true that there were periods of the Earth's past where there was much more CO2 in the atmosphere. One point, the rate of change of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is happening far faster than at any point in the Earth's history, even faster than, say, the Paleocene thermal maximum, where there was a lot of volcanic activity, and that means that the effect that it would have on human life and the effect that it would have on animals and all life is not allowing life to respond to that. So that's one reason why we want to limit the effects of global warming. And the second point to make is that just because there was a time in the Earth's history doesn't mean we'd want to live at that point. So paleoclimate is all very interesting, and we know that when it was 1,000 parts per million, the sea levels were much higher. And given that most of the Earth's a lot of the Earth's population lives in low-lying regions or on coasts, it would not be desirable for us to live in that kind of world.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl. I've got Gina. She's going to come in. Gina, God bless you. It's lovely to see you. How are you?
Hi, Bob. God bless you too. It's nice to be here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. I'm going to start your minute now.
Thank you. Hi, panel and chat too. My question is, what do you think would be the environmental impact if large parts of the population switch to a vegan or vegetarian diet? I'm asking because these horrible mass production slaughterhouses are surely a huge crime against the animals, and this is surely not what God wanted, and it's also horrible for the environment. So and I love it that Christians go vegan for Lent and Advent. That's great. So yeah, that's my question. What do you think would be the impact on the environment be? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gina. Go on, guys.
Well, my personal view is that I'm not sure it's easy to say what exactly that would do. It would depend on how many people did it and exactly what people did, because it's not clear to me. I mean, I think going away from a meat-based diet is a good move overall, but I think the consequences of changing to other diets, it depends what you put into these other diets. Because if the consequence is that you are now expecting farmers in poor countries to produce avocados or whatever your current vegetarian or vegan preference is, I'm not sure that's actually helping very much. So I think you have to think very carefully about some of these issues, because I'm not sure you can give a nice, neat, yes, if we all go vegan, it'll solve the problem, or it'll do something. It might not. Depends exactly what that means.
Okay. I'm going to just bring up some comments, guys, and I'd like you to, someone to jump on a comment and respond. So here's, we got let's go nuclear, yes or no. So does that help or hinder the issue?
I can jump in on this and maybe just make a point and then share a screen. Nuclear could be an important part of a future low carbon electricity system. It's zero carbon at the point of generation, and it can operate at all times, which is good. The challenge with nuclear is its cost. It's very expensive, and it's not getting cheaper over time. Actually, the cost of nuclear is getting more expensive over time, whereas the cost of wind and solar is falling really rapidly. So if nuclear is going to make a contribution, it needs to be able to stand on its own feet. I'm personally skeptical, therefore, that it'll do a big part, but absolutely, we shouldn't rule it out as part of the toolbox.
Okie dokie. Next comment. Corner to Carl. So the climate response is to get the right rate, not the right level.
Yes. So I think what you're, I guess this is to respond to whether it's at what kind of parts per million in would be ideal, and whether it's the rate of change that's the problem or the level that we're at. I think the issue is it's both. Life and human life and human civilization has adapted to a certain regime that we're used to, and so we do want to preserve that. 350 parts per million comes to within what the timescales that human civilization has been. And yes, the concern about the rate is that the rate of change is of parts per million is so large that it's very hard for all life to adapt. So I think I've answered that question. Okay. If he wants to rephrase it, then I guess he can.
Yeah, I mean, guys, I've given the link out. If people don't want to come on and sort of express themselves, then we have to interpret their words the best way we can. So who was the power to do what solution? Right, sometime, yeah. Who has the power to do what solutions we have presented here? WEF, have it all but no will to help. I'm not sure what WEF stands for. Does any of you guys know?
It's the World Economic Forum, I would imagine.
Okie dokie. Yeah. So basically, you know, who's got the power to make the change? And do you know, the assumption is that, you know, there's no will to help people. So how would you respond to that?
I don't think that's very fair for the World Economics Forum. I mean, so I've personally been republished a couple of, I think it's 2 articles talking about weather hazards and climate change by the World Economics Forum. I do agree, however, that not all of their funding for countries' debt in the face of the climate crisis is the best as it could be. But I think there is something that we can all do. I mean, if you wrote to the World Economics Forum and made your case for why you think that they could do something better, I'm pretty sure they'd listen to you if you made a good case for that. I mean, like writing to your MP, like you can write to the World Economics Forum, you can write to UN agencies, you can write to the World Meteorological Organization, governments, you know, Red Cross Climate Center, all of these people. If you disagreed with something they were doing and you gave a good case for it, they'd listen to you. And if more of us do it, then they'll listen to you. It's just about how you make the case, and don't completely dismiss what they're doing currently, because they're trying to do a really difficult job to solve a crisis, and they're trying to do it with the resources they have available to them. It's the same with the church as well. Like if you write to your minister or you write to the leaders of your church, again, it's just not about dismissing everybody and what they stand for, but actually making a case for why your solution might be better. Like if you're on Dragon's Den and you were pitching a business, basically the same idea.
It's about a positive action as opposed to throwing up the hands and saying there's nothing that we can do and dismissing other actors.
I think the thing, though, there is action has to be taken at several different levels, which is why it's complicated, because it's got to be about us as individuals taking actions. It's about politicians and those who lead countries taking actions, but it's also about corporations, businesses, and them taking action. So it's not like it's like one simple solution that you know, if somebody does X, it will solve the problem. It requires will on the part of a number of different groups of people or different parts of our society to take action. And I think that's why it's difficult to make some of these things happen, because you know people always look and say, well, if they do something, we'll do something. It becomes very complicated in that sort of sense. But I think you need to be action at several levels, not just at one level.
Yeah, and I do see you, Isaac, and I am going to let you in. I do think that this is something that Christians need to get much better at, is recognizing, and in not just at this problem, but at every kind of problem that the church faces, is that there are some problems you can deal with as an individual. There are some problems you need to deal with as a congregation. There are some problems you need to deal with as a network of congregations. And then it's like sometimes it's the entire denomination or the whole body of Christ that needs to deal with a topic or an issue. And if we applied that thinking much more, we'd be much more effective in society on a range of different things. So I'm just going to let in Isaac.
Hey, how you doing?
How you doing, Isaac? Good to see you, bro. You okay?
Oh, yeah, I'm good. It's kind of a conspiracy. I don't even know if I believe in it, but it's like a thought that comes to my mind. Like, what if, like, I know you guys are talking about global warming. What if global warming is just a sign of the end times, and like this is, no matter what you do, it's going to be like God, like all the tsunamis or volcano eruptions. This was just like God's impending doom type of like scenario. Like, you think that can be like part of what's going on here, or you think it's purely like carbon and us doing this?
Okay, thank you very much. Isaac, I'll just going to take you out, but feel free to come back in as many times as you like.
I think, good question, Isaac, and thanks for asking it. I think, earlier Neil actually spoke from the Old Testament prophets how God was able to use people to bring about his own ends of judgment. So it doesn't have to be an either or of, well, climate change is causing bad things, therefore this is end times, therefore it's not human involvement. No, absolutely. And again, another interesting thing. So you see that, God used Babylon to bring judgment upon disobedient Israel, but then punished Babylon. So it's not, that doesn't at all excuse human actions, even if it is part of a greater divine plan.
But to show, I just want to jump in on that. But if we allow the idea that this, you know, that actually this is part of God's judgment, should we oppose it? Should we? Is it to go against God's will to oppose it? If you see what I'm saying.
I think the difficulty I have with the God's judgment argument is that who are we to know what's God's judgment? You know, I've heard over my life as a Christian, I've been a Christian for over 40 odd years now, a number of people ascribing various things as being God's judgment in various situations. But when I look at them, I find it very difficult to say, well, that's God's judgment. I mean, who am I to, only God knows that. I don't think we have that degree of revelation individually or even corporately to say this is God's judgment. I think, you know, Jesus said there be famines, there be wars, rumors of, all those things have been going on since Jesus went to the cross and rose again. And I think some of these things are just part of being in a fallen world and things go wrong. And, you know, you can see climate change as being part of that. We're fallen human beings. We don't behave or obey God the way we should. So, you know, I'm very wary of saying this is God's judgment in the sort of specific sense and sort of trying to tie things down, because I think we don't know. We don't know exactly what God's doing, and we don't even know. Jesus said he didn't know when he was going to return. So, you know, who am I to say whether this is the end times, Jesus is coming next week or 1,000 years from now? I have no idea, and I don't think we should go down that route. It's not very helpful. I think the route we should be going down is the one I said earlier: love God and love your neighbour and live accordingly.
I would add to that the special love that we have to the church. You know, I think as Christians we focus on love God, love your neighbor, but we forget that there is a special solidarity and love that we owe to the confederacy of the church.
Well, I agree. You said that earlier when you said do good to all, especially the household of faith. I mean, I agree with that statement.
And my point being is that the church is the global south is where most Christians are. So, you know, these are our own people that are suffering.
Yeah.
I think we've got a bit of a debate going here between Rob and Carl. He's come back, but Carl, the parts per million, I'll try to do you justice, Rob, in the way that I intonate, you know, but Carl, the parts per million got much higher than now when humans were not here, allegedly. Can we really stop CO2 getting to 1,000 parts per million if it's a natural cycle?
Yes. Okay. Good question. So I think there's a slight confusion here about the time at which the Earth was 1,000 parts per million. We discussed earlier with the first slide that we shared, and we saw how actually the temperatures were decreasing in the world. We were not heading towards 1,000 parts per million, and actually we were in a interglacial in the geological terms. So when the Industrial Revolution happened, there was a very rapid increase in the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that has been associated with the rapid temperature rise that we're seeing in the world. And that absolutely is reversible because we can do things to stop emitting, and then we would get to net zero. And there are various technologies and approaches, natural and man-made, that Neil will be able to tell you a lot about to remove the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So yes, what we're seeing as a result of climate change is not part of that cycle. So don't confuse the fact that it was very high at one particular point with the fact that it's high now, because the causes were very different as well as the timescales.
I do think I've got some other comments that I want to bring in, but I do think that technology is like absolutely crucial to this battle. And, you know, that sort of begs questions about, you know, like whether capitalism is part of the answer or part of the problem, you know. But as I'll take Neil's earlier counsel about not getting wrapped up in the bigger economic questions. I want to bring in another comment. I'm sorry, Neil, I know you wanted to jump in, but
all good.
You tend to find as time gets more constrained, my urgency about getting more stuff in becomes more. I do see you, Isaac, and I will let you in, but I just want them to respond to this comment. So could you ask the panelists what they could say to skeptics who don't believe there is climate change crisis, but it is a conspiracy? Now, I'd only like one of you to jump on that, please.
Well, I can say what I think.
Go on.
I mean, the idea that carbon dioxide will cause the planet to warm has been around since the 19th century. The scientists came up with that sort of theory well before anybody noticed that global warming was happening. So the basic science of the planet, if you put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the planet will warm, has been around since the 1800s. 1850, 70, I can't remember the exact dates, but way back in the 19th century. So there's nothing conspiracy about that, because they didn't even know the planet was warming at that point. So the basic physics is clear. Add CO2 to the atmosphere, the planet will warm. There is not a conspiracy. It's a physical fact. And we, as human beings, since the Industrial Revolution, have been adding CO2 to the atmosphere. So the planet will get warmer. There's no conspiracy theory in that. That's basic physics. If you've studied any physics at any level, you can't get away from that. You can claim it's a conspiracy, but it's difficult to get away from physical facts.
Yeah, and you can replicate it in a greenhouse. You know, you can do an experiment in your own greenhouse on your back garden. Just pump some carbon dioxide into it and notice how much hotter it gets. So go and test it, but don't go in
there for too long. Don't
go in there. Sorry, I'm not responsible if you kill yourself, by the way, guys. Okay, so I'm going to let Isaac back in. He's come back with go on, Isaac, bro.
Hello. Yeah, kind of tied in both the questions. I think maybe the conspiracies that people's having is not so much about like global warming itself, rather what politicians are going to do, like what bills are going to be passed. For example, like the new Green Deal, there's something in it where like minorities, right, are going to be getting a higher chance of getting jobs. So I'm saying, wouldn't the concern be what are the people in power going to do in response to global warming and how that can be affecting like Christians? Like, you know, like look what happened with the COVID restrictions. Churches were closed. So I think that's where the conspiracy part comes in. Like what bills are going to be passed that we should be worried about?
Okay, thank you very much, Isaac. And just before anyone jumps in on that, I just want to say that this is, as someone who fully agrees with everything you're saying in terms of the science and the fact of the environmental crisis, you know, I am also concerned about what other kinds of politics are going to be piggybacked onto the response to the environmental crisis. So I fully get where he's coming from, though maybe I might have picked different examples. So, you know, how would you respond to that?
Well, I think one point to make is that the situation in the UK is different to the USA. As far as I know, there's nothing piggybacking on the Climate Change Act in the UK, which is aimed primarily at us reducing our CO2 emissions and doesn't have anything else tied to it at all politically, as far as I understand it. And that's agreed among all the parties, which will be like the Republicans and the Democrats in the USA agreeing that getting rid of CO2 was a good idea. The US situation I'm not so familiar with, and I have no idea what's going on exactly there. So it's difficult for me to comment on that. But certainly in the UK, I'm not aware of anybody trying to piggyback political things onto climate change issues in our political system.
And do you think that Christians, if we see in other countries governments trying to piggyback anti-Christian or things that go against the Christian worldview politics connected to the environment or connected to the response to the environmental crisis, that we as Christians should be calling that out?
I think you could call out perhaps the bit that you were concerned was going against your Christian faith. However, I don't think you should act against it being a positive for the environment. So you should stand up for your belief and make the case that you feel that something else is being piggybacked on the back of the environmental agenda. So yeah, I don't think you should stop environmental, but you could point out what you disagreed with. I don't think that anybody would have a problem with that.
I would say more than pointing it out, we should oppose any piggybacking on environmental concerns.
Can I just make one point, which I would say I would agree with Merrick that I think in the UK, and I think in many countries, the sort of concern that climate change, sort of other issues might piggyback on the climate change agenda. I'm much less worried about that than the other way round, that political parties who stand for a lot of traditional Christian values that many on this call will be really supportive of are actually opposed to or dropping the climate change ball. And I think from our conversation today, I would say climate change is a fundamental, it's an issue that we should be caring about as Christians. In terms of people with a pro-life standpoint, climate change is going to cause huge amounts of death and suffering. And I would be more concerned with people who stand for a lot of Christian values that we might want to support, but who are dropping the ball on this. I think that there's a much greater risk of that than the other way around.
Okay, I just want to bring up another comment by Rob. I really want to thank you, Rob, and Isaac for really engaging. I appreciate it, guys. Okay, for the last 50 years, the tipping point, I'll try and do my best Rob impression. For the last 50 years, the tipping point has always been 10 years away. Has crying wolf caused us to stop caring about what government and scientists say? And I actually think he's onto something there.
So it is proven that the fear messaging around tipping points actually isn't targeted at adults. It works more in children. So that's why now climate scientists are moving more towards a storyline approach. So we show that what the impacts are. So, for example, someone was pointing out that there was lack of sanitation in Africa. There is in some countries, including, say, and we know that with climate change, there's less access to water, so that decreases sanitation. That would be how I would now approach it. Whereas in the past, you might have seen a climate scientist being like, okay, there's deaths of thousands of people in Burkina Faso because they have no water sanitation, and this is increasing with climate change. We need to act now. So it's just kind of about how you frame it. And what we're learning is more about communication and the psychology of the brain and how we react to things that are visible and invisible and all of those sort of things. And actually, COVID messaging was really good for learning about how to message something over a long period of time without having crying wolf, without having all the fear, but also keeping people safe. And that's something that is being taken on board and account for communicating climate change better. So there is a whole other piece of science that actually looks at this, and it's really fascinating, but we haven't got it right yet, and we're learning basically because everybody's learning.
I think that a lot of the COVID messaging, I'd take you up on that, on the COVID messaging about whether it was fear driven. I do think, but it's a separate issue. For me, I think that one of the big problems around messaging, as Rob has stated, is that, Robert, there has been this sense of we've got to act. We've only got this much time left to act. We've only got this much time left to act. We've only got this much time left to act. The most recent thing that's come out is it's now or never. It's like we either act now or we get maybe the worst scenario. I don't know. I often think that part of the problem in the messaging is that there seems to be a false hope that's been promised. And I know we touched on it earlier, which is this idea that somehow we can avoid catastrophe. And that, I think, implies to people that we're not actually facing a catastrophe yet. That the catastrophe point is still a little bit in front of us, when actually it strikes me that the catastrophe point was like maybe 80 or 90 years behind us.
Well, I think for some people on the planet, the catastrophe point has been and gone. There are people on the planet suffering. For us, in our particular context in the UK, we're not suffering that much. So in one sense, you could say that's why people are skeptical of the catastrophe sort of message, because they look around and say, well, we're not suffering. But if they were living in sub-Saharan Africa or on a small island somewhere in the Pacific, they might have a different perspective on that. For a lot of those people, the catastrophe has already happened. So I think you're right. We need to think about that carefully and how we explain what's going on. And you can't motivate people out of fear, I don't think. I don't think fear is a particularly good motivator. I think and that we can still, by making a difference in terms of how we emit carbon dioxide, we can still make a difference as to what will happen to my children and my children's children and how they live, because they may suffer consequences that I don't. I'm not saying they will, but it depends what we do and now. But, yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just seeing if we've got any more comments. Here we go. All right, what have we got? Let's have a look. What's that saying? Your Rob impression is exactly the same as you use. Yeah, sorry. All right, that's fair enough. Okay, so any more comments for the panel, guys? As we sort of bring this into land, there's someone who's been very verbose. Dave, okay, I know you've been trying to get on. Is there anything that you want to say? All right, hold on. No, that's you guys talking amongst yourselves. Here we go. Dave and the High Vibe, I think it is, who've been very verbose in the chat. Why don't you actually direct a comment or a question to these guys? I know you've been very vocal in the chat to other people, but here's your chance to explain why all these people are perhaps wrong or misguided, or to throw out your key question that silences them all. I mean, like, that's why we're doing this. But I noticed that you're talking to everyone else and you're saying that this is all a load of rubbish. But when you're given the opportunity to argue with the experts, you're not taking it up. So Gina, the lovely Gina from Cologne, says, I have another question. Do the panelists know of any research being done into capturing CO2 and exhaust toxins from the atmosphere? Do we have the technology?
I can come in briefly on this. This is the exact stuff that my research focuses on, is technologies that capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and remove them. And my brief answer would be, yes, we do have some of those technologies. The most obvious example being trees. Trees are great machines to suck CO2 out of the atmosphere, and they do it, all around the world. And planting some more trees would be a good thing. There are lots of other technologies, including some more interesting engineered options. So one, we do have the technology, but two, it's very risky to rely on it because we're not quite sure how much we'll be able to sort of upscale that. So at the moment, we're not sucking much CO2 out of the atmosphere, and we don't want to bet on being able to do loads of it in the future. So still the most important thing is to turn off that emissions tap and cut emissions, cut putting it up in the first place. But absolutely part of the solution will be taking it back out in the future. And a range of solutions will be available.
Forgive me, Neil, I'm going to use my prerogative and jump in there, because I think for me, God is no fool, and he's already created a world that can balance itself out. And to me, it seems that if we follow natural theology, that and we just allow God's own mechanisms to work, that rewilding is actually the simplest and one of the easiest ways to make a positive impact. You've got rich countries in Europe lecturing the Brazilian poor about cutting down the rainforests, which I have some sympathy for you. But why don't we reforest in Europe? Why don't we do more to reforest Europe, reforest England, rewild the environment, and restore our own kind of ecosystem balance?
Just two quick points. I think some of that is being done in Europe, but probably not enough. But the second point is, I think you're wrong. It's not the poor in Brazil that are cutting down the rainforest. It's big companies, big corporations for other reasons. It's not poor people to get more land for farming.
I guess what I'm saying is those corporations employ poor people. And those
I'm not sure they do, actually, but anyway, we can argue about that.
No. I'm not in a position really to argue. The reason why I wanted to bring you guys on is so that you could argue. I'm not in a position to argue against you guys or for you guys. We've got another one here from Patrick. How do you get this message across to the likes of China and India, and do the panel think that they will take any notice? Great question.
I think there was a lot. So I've just reviewed a paper by some Chinese scientists on unlivable temperatures, and actually they make a really great case, what Neil was saying, of turning off the emissions tap. So there's actually scientists in China that are funded by Chinese government like grants to do their research that are saying to China, we need to turn off the tap. And also like China, they're really like protective of their future generations, like elders and stuff is really important. Family is really important in Chinese culture. And so I think that really could win out in turning China onto more of a green economy. Like they are doing it, but they also are opening like coal mining. So they're not there yet, but they're getting there. I mean, that doesn't go against like all of the other things that happen in China politically, but you know, there is a fight there. And the same with India as well. That's the same with India. It's actually incredible that there is scientists fighting for this in those countries too. And we should just support that.
Yeah, which is, and you know, we pray for our brothers and sisters both in China and India, where they're being persecuted by the Communist Party and by Hindutva. Guys, you know, are you enjoying yourselves? Like, I'm tempted. I could keep going for a bit longer if you guys could keep going for a bit longer, but I don't want to impose it on you. We've got about 5 minutes based on what we agreed. What's the vote?
Fine by me.
Are you happy maybe to go on for half an hour more so we can get more comments?
I think I'll need to bow out solely from the point of view of I haven't had any dinner yet, and I should probably go and eat some food, it being 9 o'clock here. So
fair enough.
I will bow out, but do feel free to keep the conversation
stay
going.
on for 5 more minutes. Still got you for 5 minutes.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
Just before you go then, Neil, like there's obviously at some point, because a video of mine will get watched by about 1,000 people or more in a week, sometimes more depending on the topic. And there's going to be non-Christians who are watching this debate and non-Christians who are interacting with this issue. They're concerned about the environment, but they're not Christian. What would you say to them in terms of Christ's relevance to this question of environment?
That's a great question.
And actually, I'm going to invite you all to jump in on that, but I'll start with Neil.
I would say two things. That Jesus Christ calls us to live lives of responsibility, and that involves some engagement with responsibility for the earth. You know, we've seen that. We've been talking about the sort of the message throughout the Old Testament, and we know that when Jesus come, you know, I've not come to abolish the law or the prophets, but to fulfill it. He's got a high regard for those mandates that are given to the people in Genesis and in other places. So Jesus Christ is giving you, I would say to everyone, Jesus Christ is giving you a responsibility to care for the planet. And secondly, I would say because of Jesus Christ, we have hope that this can be solved. You know, I don't know on an individual level exactly how this will plan out, but I know that, you know, through Christ, all things will be reconciled. What does that mean? That's a big question, but that gives me a sense that I know that in the long term, all things will be well and all manner of things will be well, in the words of Julian Norwich. And so the Christian faith gives me hope to address this. And I think it can give you hope if you're despairing at the signs of the environmental crisis.
Thank you so much. Neil, if you need to go, bro, I fully appreciate it. Peace be with you.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob, and thanks everyone for the conversations. I hope you guys have a great rest of the time.
Thank you. So I'll ask all three of you to wade in on that question, because I think that is a fundamentally important question. I think that we have to relate not to our discipleship in the Lord through the question of the environmental crisis, but we have to relate to the environmental crisis through the prism of our discipleship in the Lord. So, you know, and there's going to be people that are looking at this and dismissive of the Christian faith, you know, and I'm not seeing that it's relevant to the big issues of the day. So how do you guys, you know, relate to the environmental crisis through your discipleship in the Lord? And what would you say to those people who are watching this? They care about the environment, but they don't care about our Lord.
I mean, so a lot of the people that I work with care deeply about the environment, but aren't Christians. And that doesn't mean that I wouldn't work with them. If they wanted to get interested in my faith, or if that went for anybody watching your channel, Bob, I think that there is ways and means that they can do that. And one way they can do that is pray and ask that Jesus reveals himself to them. But I also think that even though there are some people that aren't Christian, that doesn't mean that God isn't working within them. And I think that a lot of the people perhaps that I have seen throughout my life who aren't Christian, perhaps God has been working within them and through them. They just don't know it yet. So and also you can pray for people in your own lives that they will come to God, or they will become a Christian or a person of faith. Yeah, I think there's a lot of things you can do, and a lot of things that people who are interested in faith can do.
Yeah, I think to the point of discipleship, I think it comes back to what Merrick was saying about love God and love your neighbor. If this is, and that's the ground of all our discipleship. You know, I want to love God with my finances. I want to love God with in every decision I make. That and I think. Given the nature of the world we live in, given what we're doing to God's creation, and given that the call that we have to be kings and priests in this world that we've discussed, and given that Christ calls us to love our neighbor, particularly those in the household of faith, then that all flows out of my discipleship and following Christ. And I think I would particularly add to this idea of hope that Neil brought up. I think it's very difficult. I've met lots of people, environmental activists or others of my colleagues, and it's very difficult for them to have hope if you come face to face with seeing how little action there can be done for so many decades, and we've known how serious the issue has been, and essentially you're coming face to face with human greed and sin and pride, and it's very hard if you're not a Christian and you're taking these issues seriously to really face up to them. And so there are a lot of people struggling with anxiety around these sorts of issues. And we have an ultimate hope because we are a new creation, and when Jesus returns, he will bring a new creation, and we are part of that world. So Christians live lives of hope. It's a hope grounded in Easter Sunday, in the resurrection. Amen. That we will celebrate this Sunday. And if that is not something you believe and you're listening to this, and investigate the claims of the resurrection. And if Christ is risen, then we have hope for the future. We have hope for this world, and it is a genuine hope in a new creation where there will be no more crying or death or pain.
And just before you jump in, Dr. Merrick, I just want to say, when a Christian speaks about hope, it can often sound like a very gooey, kind of gushy emotion. But that is not the idea of Christian hope. The idea of Christian hope is an inner conviction and an absolute resolute decision within your mind and your soul that your actions can affect change, that what you do does make a difference. And that's what Christian hope is. It's not some sentimental feeling. It is a resolute belief that through you God can work and does work, and if you allow him, he will work. Dr. Merrick, what are your thoughts to that question?
Well, I would have gone down the hope route with Neil and Carl, so I shan't bother repeating all that because they said it so well. So I would agree with that. I think having hope in what appear to be desperate situations is really critical to being able to work to change those situations. And the other thing from my perspective as a Christian is the verse in Corinthians that says, let me just make sure I quote this correctly, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. So I know that as a Christian, what I'm doing is not in vain. It's not wasted. It's not pointless. I'm participating in bringing God's kingdom, and that includes in terms of climate change responses and so on. I'm doing things that are worth doing because I'm trying to do them for God. And that gives purpose and direction to our lives. We're not just wandering around lost and uncertain about what's going to happen in the future, because we know who we trust. It says faith, hope, and love in 1 Corinthians 13. And I think those things, we know who we're trusting, we have hope for the future, and we know that he loves us, God loves us, and that we can love him and love our brothers and sisters and act accordingly.
Brilliant. Guys, I'm going to do a few more comments, and then we'll bring this to a wrap up. So Rob, I really love the fact that Rob has engaged so well in this. Rob states, getting atmosphere is probably easy, but the sea is a much bigger sink. Should it stay there, or can we remove it from the sea? I'm not quite sure. Is he talking? I think he's talking about carbon.
Yeah. He's talking about carbon dioxide is absorbed into the ocean, and that's what's leading to ocean acidification, and that in turn is causing problems with coral reefs and all sorts of stuff. I think the thing is that you're absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere, so the best thing you can do is to cut CO2 in the atmosphere. Removing it from the oceans, natural processes will remove it from the oceans over the long term. I'm not sure there's an easy way to shift it out of the oceans in the short term. So there are issues like ocean acidification, which will persist even if we stop emitting carbon dioxide tomorrow, because we've already put some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere into the ocean. There are various plans for doing things with CO2 in the ocean. I'm not convinced that any of them feasible personally, but people talk about these things. But yeah, I think that's a problem that will not go away quickly. But natural processes will bring that back into balance, but over a long time scale.
Couldn't natural processes just bring the environment or the atmospheric CO2 back into balance?
From what I remember, and Carl could probably correct me as an atmospheric physicist, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for quite a long time. So what we've already put in the atmosphere, natural processes will remove it. But you're talking, I don't know, 200-300 years is what sticks in my mind. I could be wrong about that time scale. So natural processes will work, but it'll take a long time for them to take that. We'd have to stop emitting CO2 now anyway, but even then, what we've already put in will take a while to get out.
Okay. You're nodding in agreement, so I don't think we need to repeat ourselves. Robert's got another point. China is only interested in promoting green tech because they hold the monopoly on renewable tech and the required minerals. Be skeptical about anything China says. How would you respond to that, guys?
I think, I would agree with that. But China hold a monopoly over a lot of things. Perhaps we will see a move away from China having such a monopoly as we see post-globalization, I think you would call it, which is like where we move back to having countries manufacture stuff more in country. But I don't think that we could claim to know all of the motivations of those in charge of China. And also, if we think about God acting through people, we also don't know all of the motivations and the judgment of God in this. And it says that all of his plans work together for good. So perhaps we could be a little bit more hopeful as Christians that if we start working together and the scientists in China are working together to show that they need to cut carbon emissions, that there will be something good comes out of this, even if we're skeptical about everything China says, of course.
Okay, let's go on to the next one. Oops, sorry, I'll be back. Not just trees, peatland too. Lots of money is being ploughed into peatland restoration, but it's a tough job. I think that's probably in connection to my earlier comment about rewilding.
I think it's about removing CO2 in the atmosphere.
Oh, okay then.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Yes.
Go on, expand on that for people.
Peatland is it's not just about planting trees. And I think Prof. Yaffel also mentioned earlier that you have to think quite carefully about where in the world you plant trees and what ecosystems you plant and which trees you plant. That's something that we are doing some of in Scotland is peatland restoration, as well as rewilding. these because they can be really significant carbon sinks.
And the same's true in a sort of ocean situation where people talk about blue carbon. If you plant mangroves, they absorb a lot of carbon. They also have a secondary effect in they improve the ecosystem and biodiversity where you plant them, so you're restoring biodiversity. They also act as a shield for coastlines against big waves and things washing onto the coast. So there's lots of positive things you can do where you do things which work with the natural systems to help remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Not just trees, but mangroves. There's a whole load of things you can do like that.
Yeah, I honestly believe that like we should trust the natural mechanism God provides, and I think rewilding is a massive way forward, especially for, you know, it's all right the elites sort of pointing to other parts of the world and saying, like, there's a disaster over there and there's a disaster over there, when there's actually so much potential to undo the disaster of 100, 200 years ago in this continent through rewilding and through restoring an ecosystem that may in some way, you know, begin to offset some of the damage that's happening in the Amazonian rainforests, in the Brazilian rainforests. And I think we should focus a lot more on the issue of rewilding. I want to bring up this comment because I think this will touch on how a lot of people think about this and the matrix of this, which is, you know, why are we so worried about this earth? Why aren't we more worried about the people who don't believe in Jesus? You know, now as an evangelist and as someone who cares passionately, most passionately about people coming to the Lord, I could say quite honestly that these two things don't have to be in contradiction, and that good discipleship requires us to consider how our lives are lived socially, politically, economically, culturally, you know, and that therefore impacts on how we relate to the environment. And so this is more about a discipleship question than it is about an evangelism. And we don't need to set these two things up in contradiction to one another. But I think also, I would say that for Christians, and I will let you guys come in on this, I promise, but for Christians, one of the best ways to do evangelism is to show that our faith does really relate to people's lives. One of the most common things that I hear from people who are dismissing the Christian faith is that it's not relevant. And we've got to show how Christianity is relevant, but relevant giving its own answers to the problems, not simply jumping on the backs of other groups' answers to the problems, unless those other groups are saying the same thing that our own apostles and prophets teach. So that's my thought on this question, and I feel as an evangelist I can actually say something on it. But how do you guys respond to that?
Well, I agree with it's not a either or, it's a both and. I mean, you know, I talk to people about my faith, but I also want to see us tackling climate change. I don't see the two are in contradiction. And in fact, sometimes the fact that I'm involved in climate change issues gives me an opportunity to talk to people about my faith. So the two are not in contradiction. I don't see this either or approach. And also, if you think of us as the body of Christ, you know, some of us are scientists and some of us are evangelists, and you know, we all contribute. As part of being part of the body, we all expressing something of what Jesus is like in different ways.
Amen. Any other thoughts on that before I bring up the next comment? Okay,
I've answered that well.
Brilliant. I'll bring up this one then, and then I mean, maybe one more after this, and then we'll sort of bring it to a close. So, what's your opinion on carbon taxes on corporations, and do we feel a threat this will come to become on individual carbon tax? Should our less fortunate Christians be worried? So here's I think I understand the gist of the question, which is, what's your thought on taxing corporations around a carbon tax? And is that the thin end of the wedge that will then increase a carbon tax burden that rests heavier and heavier on individuals including the poor, as in poor Christians. I think that's probably what Isaac is getting at there. How would you respond to that? Oh, has he silenced you?
Well, I don't know much about carbon tax, so I'm not. I can't really comment. Don't know.
Fair
anything
enough.
about
I think that, so I'm not 100% sure how much corporations are taxed for their carbon. I know that there's carbon offsetting and carbon credits, and carbon offsetting has its own set of problems because it means that they don't reduce the overall amount of carbon they actually produce. They just give it to someone who is producing less carbon, which doesn't really work, and not everything is tracked. Carbon taxing, I think it could work. I think it is something that, as Neil would say, we should have in our toolbox. However, I think it should be legislated so that companies don't pass it on to consumers, because, I mean, they're the ones, the companies are the ones that are producing the carbon. However, you could move as a consumer to a company that isn't passing you on the carbon tax, which would be a powerful move for poor Christians if that was available to them. But I would advocate for good legislation that put in place carbon taxing effectively, to be honest.
Would you oppose, as the only person that offered an opinion on that, would you oppose in carbon taxing individuals?
Yes, I would oppose carbon taxing individuals because I think that it would just be a social justice issue if you carbon taxed individuals, and it would build a divide between people, and we don't want more conflict. We want consensus and action on climate change, not conflict on climate change.
Because obviously the rich would be able to continue to live their lives whilst the poor would feel that burden.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, guys, go on. Do you want to?
So I'm sure Neil knows much more about this this kind of question. It's a shame it's a shame he's gone. But it is a, like, the concern around your art, like this whole concern about, well, if you respond to this in a policy that that then affects the poorest in a very negative way, that is definitely a valid concern, and a concern that we should have as Christians. So I agree with Isaac's point there. I think there are different models for how you implement taxes, and Chloe has alluded to different ways of doing this. We can't ourselves speak into the specifics, but that's definitely something to think about. I think there are, though, if we don't have something like a carbon tax, if we don't have some way of essentially valuing, all the carbon tax is doing is reflecting the cost to the earth of a certain product, right? So there's our economic system without some sort of effect like a carbon tax is very much out of kilter, because then we're buying products that are much cheaper, and then maybe cheaper products will be produced in ways that are less environmentally responsible, and so I think it essentially helps bring our economy into balance in a certain way. People talk about externalities in this context, that climate change is an externality, and so you can provide a carbon tax to correct for those sorts of negative effects. We're not experts in the economics.
I think the thing is, we accept shepherding in terms of taxing already. I mean, it's already occurring. There's many examples of where taxes are used, for instance, to discourage cigarette use. So it is something that we already use in our society. And yes, it could definitely be part of the tool. But I think as Christians, we have to make sure that any sort of tax system does not fall unduly heavily on the poor in the cause of the environment. It's kind of like we have to make sure that the poorest in society are protected, and it's not just a sort of free pass for the rich to go and continue their lives whilst the poor bear the brunt of it. Guys, I'm sure we could keep going. I am sure that there is a lot more that could be said. However, I think we should probably stop it there. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your evenings and coming and sitting with us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've really enjoyed it, and I will go back over this. And I'll go back over this and see what I can learn more from it. And if the people want to do this again, I'm happy to run this again and maybe have some of you back, possibly even organise a debate if anyone feels up for it. I'll close us in prayer. If you just bear with me 1 second while I go and get something. And I just want to wish you guys a really lovely Easter for when it comes, and enjoy all the chocolate, vegan chocolate. Okay. I mean, there's whole conversations to be had around the question of veganism. Someone who will definitely be enjoying meat on Sunday. So don't stone me, Paul. Okay, so thank you guys so much. And if you want to hang around just for a few minutes after the live stream ends, we'll have a quick talk, but I'll close us in prayer. O Christ our God, who at all times and in every hour, in heaven and on earth, are worshipped and glorified, who are long-suffering, merciful and compassionate, who love the just and show mercy upon the sinner, who call all to salvation through the promise of blessings to come. O Lord, in this hour receive our supplications and direct our lives according to your commandments. Sanctify our souls, hallow our bodies, correct our thoughts, cleanse our minds, deliver us from all tribulation, evil, and distress. Encompass us with your holy angels, that, guided and guarded by them, we may attain to the unity of the faith and to the knowledge of your unapproachable glory. For you are blessed unto the ages of ages, world without end. Amen.
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 Good night, guys. God bless.
Good night.
Right.